Hello there, everybody. This is Kyle from Intro Audio, and I'm going to be starting out a series of videos that we're going to be focusing on sound design and just general different production things, some arranging, um, sort of how melodies are built, that kind of thing. We're just going to be getting into the nitty gritty and the basics of music production, specifically electronic music production. And with that, I figured the best way to start that out and to kind of just begin the series is to start with the basics. Um, because once I get into the more advanced things, I feel like it's going to be a lot easier for everyone to follow if you have the basics out of the way, if you know them, if they're like the back of your hand, you got them down. So we're going to start with the basics. Once I get to the advanced things, then at that point, we won't have to constantly be referencing the same things over and over again as far as compression and what we're doing in general. So it'll save everybody time. So with that, the first thing I wanted to get into was just the basic layout and the method of operating Ableton, which is what I think the majority of these videos are going to be in. I might do a few things in Reaper, just introducing people to that. The actual methodology between the two is going to be pretty much the same. I mean, things will go by different names, and the way that you actually do them might differ slightly, but the same functions that we'll be going over in this video will pretty much be usable under any other digital audio workstation. So we're going to focus on Ableton because that is what a large amount of people are using, and so it's the best way to kind of focus it in and make it homogeneous across everybody. So with that, let's go ahead and get into it. So we're going to be looking at this today from an already finished track that I just released a few days ago. And so we're going to go through that, listen to a few little bits of it, and then I'm going to break them down a little bit, show you what the different audio effects over here, what those are doing. And then I'm going to break them down a little bit further and explain how those function, basically. And then we'll slap a few on there that aren't already on there just to display what they do. So let's get to it. So we'll just play the first little bit of the song.
Burning in my soul, this love burning in my soul, this love burning in my.
Okay, so with that, obviously the biggest thing in there that you're going to be hearing is the vocals. And there's actually a lot that I've done with these vocals. So let me open those up. So the basic way that these are set up is they are just running inside of Simpler in Ableton, is what it's called. I mean, every DAW that's worth its salt comes with some sort of sampler. This is what Ableton's looks like. So we're just playing this little clip right here,
Burning in,
and I'll solo that for you.
burning in my soul.
And what's happening there is we've got a little bit of beat repeat that comes in later, so we'll just minimize that now because you guys don't really need to see that. And as you can tell, those of you that already are used to Ableton, I don't have any effects on this specific lane. And the reason for that is that this is all getting grouped into this main one called Vox. So I've got that. Later on, there's a few other little things that come in. And so I wanted them all to have similar effects on them. So the way that I did that is I grouped them up, which you can do by selecting multiple tracks, hitting Control, or if you're on Mac, Command G, and that will group all of those together. And then you can apply effects. You can see there's some audio some gain modulation here, so that you can adjust it up or down later in the track if you want something to be growing or decreasing in volume. So I've got that, and there are a few different things on this group that need some attention. So span will minimize. That's a third-party program. It's just it's just an audio spectrum. It just shows you the spectrum. So
burning in my soul.
which gives you a good breakdown of where everything is as far as the audio is concerned. But that's not really pertinent to this video, so I am going to ignore it for now. What we do have here is a gate. So the basic function of a gate is you have a lower limit, and once the volume of a signal goes above that set limit, it opens and allows that signal through. And when it dips back below, it closes and no longer lets any signal through whatsoever. So what you're seeing here
Burning in my soul.
is that once it dips below this line, which is set to negative 38.7 decibels, it's closing, no more signal. So if we turn that off, there's probably not going to be a huge difference. I don't think there's a lot of tail on this.
Burning in my soul. Burning in my soul.
So it's not super obvious on that. I think I have that gate on a few other things though, which will be a little bit more obvious, a little bit easier to understand what the function is, but it's pretty basic, pretty easy to understand. So we'll leave that on. I've got a tuner here. That was just, I was having a hard time figuring out where she was sliding with the notes to make sure that everything was in key. So threw that on there. That's pretty basic function. Just gives you a nice visualization. There are two different modes. This one's more styled like a guitar tuner. Just lets you see what the basic note is.
Burning in my soul.
Really hard to do with something that changes pitch a lot though. So I put it on this guy. So there's the tuner. And then this is just called acoustic. I just modified one of Ableton's built-in setups here because as you can see on the left, we've got all of our different audio effects and whatnot. So it's just a compressor. It just, Ableton names it whatever arbitrary name they gave it. So we've got acoustic here. I modified it a little bit. What it's doing is it's just squishing the audio a little bit. So the way the compressor works is it takes a signal, and when that signal is above a specific threshold, in this case negative 17.5 decibels, once it's above that threshold, it's going to reduce the gain on that signal by a ratio. So for every 1 decibel I go above negative 17.5 dB on this bus, it's going to reduce it by 2.25. So it essentially is a linear way of plotting it. So let me show you this. So that's the curve of it. So as you can see, when the signal's coming in, it's going to be reducing as it goes above this line.
Burning in my soul.
So that's the basic function of it. And you can do a lot with this. The attack and release are really important when it comes to compressors. This also pertains to gates as well. You don't really see a ton of difference with gates depending on what you're doing though. So I think it's more pertinent to compressors. So a longer attack essentially means that once it passes this threshold, it's going to take longer for that compressor to begin decreasing the signal. And the release is the inverse of that. Once it dips below that threshold, it's how long it's going to take for the compressor to stop reducing that gain. So, for instance, let's see here. I'm going to switch over from vocals. We're going to do something a little different, a little punchier. So, we've got this guy right here. That's side-chained. So, we'll get into that in a second. We'll throw a compressor on there just to demonstrate what I'm talking about, though. So this is the lead for the song. So from the bass, no compression whatsoever. You're not seeing any difference here. So let's go ahead and start engaging the compressor and turn off makeup gain. That's an important one. Depending on what you're wanting to do, having makeup gain on or off can make a huge difference, because what that does, as Ableton says on the left over here, it's automatically compensating for the difference. So it's going to bring your signal way up if you have a lot of compression. So for this, we're going to turn it off just so you can see the difference, or hear the difference a lot better. So and you can see this line. This is one of my favorite things about Ableton's compressor compared to a lot of others, is that it actually gives you a graph that shows where the compression's happening and how much. So we'll go ahead and turn it up to a really big ratio here, like 5, just to further show the amount, what the compressor is doing. So you can see that higher end and this trailing off bit near the end is really accentuated when you have it heavily compressed. It's going to make the softer stuff sound a lot louder, and the louder portions, the transients, sound a lot quieter. So that's the basic function of the ratio and the threshold. So we've got a lot of other options here though. So we're going to turn this ratio to like 4, bump this threshold up again a little bit. So we've got the attack and release. With that, here's what you have going with that. So we're just going to leave it at the baseline. Now, if you give it a long attack, what that's going to do is that's going to let those transients through. It's going to take longer for it to start up, so you end up making it to where the tail end of it is a lot quieter, and you get a much punchier transient right out of the gate. And you're seeing there's not a whole lot happening on those transients where it was before. Like if we bring it back down to here, there's a ton of gain reduction happening. So that's the basis of attack. Release, as I explained before, it's just how long it takes to stop compressing. Higher release times are going to mean that it's going to reduce that tail even more. This sustain on it's going to be a lot less, so it's going to really bring out the transients of it. So if we go ahead and do that, plus it makes it a lot smoother. If you have a really fast attack and a really fast release, you can really hear it when that compressor is happening, especially with more sustained notes. With things that are really choppy and quick like this, you probably wouldn't hear it as much, but if you had like a pad or something like that that has these really long sweeping portions, then you'd really start to hear that release. So it sounds pretty good with that, but that's not how I had it on the track, so it's going away. With that, so that's the basics of what a compressor does, what its function is. So we're going to go back over here. After that, that's not really important. We had that on there, but I obviously decided that I didn't really care about it. What it was, though, is it's a saturator. So I'll go ahead and bring it back real quick, just to explain what it's doing. So the saturator is going to essentially take the signal and drive it through a distortion filter. And so when it's distorting that signal, it's going to be adding some different harmonics to it that weren't previously there. And so a really good way for me to demonstrate that, let me go ahead and cut this guy out, and we will add him to a new MIDI track. So let me bring this guy up here so it's not getting hit by all of the vocal effects. And with that, we will go ahead and open up an instance of Serum and go ahead and do a sine wave, because a sine wave is going to be just purely one frequency. Whatever frequency you're playing, that's what you're hearing. Whereas with a lot of other waves, they are going to have different harmonic content. Sine waves don't have any harmonic content. With that, ahead and load this guy on there. And then Spectrum, which is the same thing as what I minimized earlier, Span. It's the same thing, it's just Ableton's version. I just like Span a little bit better. So if you double click the window here, it'll bring it up. The same thing works like EQ8 and whatnot. I'll go into that a little bit more when I get into those. But here we are. So you'll see here. There's no audio playing, but you can see if we have just the sine wave. There's a little bit of click at the beginning, so let me remove that just to make this a little bit clearer. And I'll get into all this serum stuff once we get to the serum portions of the videos, but we're not quite there yet. So we'll go ahead and solo this guy, or not. All right, we'll solo that guy. So as you can see, for a sustained note, a little bit of funky stuff happening up here. That's probably, shouldn't have 9 post reflections, but I don't know. So as you can see, that's one pure note. That's E3, that's what I'm playing. C3, boom, that's what we got. One big honking thing. So now what we can do here is if we add some distortion. See, now we've got a few other things peeking through here. It's not just this big guy here. So what distortion's doing is it's going to be adding harmonics to a signal. So if I crank up the drive on this even further, we'll go ahead and turn the wet all the way up, reduce the output so I'm not blowing everybody's ears out. Look at those. So now we've got some serious stuff happening here, and you can really hear the difference on it. So that's the basics of what a saturator does. There are a few different functions in here. There's analog clip, which is modeled after an analog saturator, kind of like what you'd find in, for instance, a guitar amplifier, or a guitar effects pedal, I should say. Something like that. So it's a little less harsh than the sine fold. Then you've got soft sine, medium curve, hard curve. Hard curve is pretty rough. Sine fold, which we already showed, digital clip, and the wave shaper, which doesn't do much if you don't mess with these other settings. So with that, you obviously got a few extra options in here. You've got the bass, frequency, width, and depth. So with that color base, it's essentially going to be shifting how it's coloring that sound. So I'll demonstrate here. We'll actually use analog clip because I think that sounds nice, and we'll turn this on. So you can see some interesting curves happening up here due to the bass. And then with that, you also can modify the frequency on this filter. So and then the width of the filter as well. So obviously a wider filter is going to include more frequencies. That's a little bit more important on things that aren't sine waves. Sine waves don't have a lot of frequency content in the first place, whereas like a saw wave has a ton. So that width gets a little bit more important with other things. And the depth is going to essentially be a dry wet for the coloring. So that's the basics of what your saturator is going to do. And then let's see here, what have we not gone over? Auto filter. Let me see where I've got that in here. Got that on this section. So we'll go ahead and pull these guys up. We'll switch this over to auto filter to see where this begins. And then we will unsolo everything.
There's a light burning in my soul. There's a light. You are. Burning in my soul.
Okay, so on first listen, if you're not super experienced with this, it might not be really obvious what what the auto filter there is doing. So I'm going to solo it and play this bass group back again with that. So it engages right here at the 17 bar mark, which is where this bass comes in. And what it does is it's a low pass filter, which I'll go more into depth with filters, what all the different types are and what they mean in some of my Serum sound design videos. The basic though, low pass, all the frequencies below a set point are allowed through. Everything above it is cut off. High pass, the exact opposite. Everything below a specific point isn't allowed through. Everything above is allowed to pass. So this is a low pass filter, so everything beneath it allowed to pass. And so what I'm doing here with auto filter is I'm modulating this filter, this low pass filter upward. So the effect that has is it's gradually allowing more and more frequency content through as it raises. So let me demonstrate that. And I'm actually going to go ahead and pull up spectrum again so you guys can get a more visual way of seeing what's happening here. So you'll notice as this goes up, you'll see more and more high frequency content. You can actually probably just see the curve straight off from it. So let me play it back. Alright, so hopefully you can see what I'm talking about here. It's gradually letting more and more through, and then I turn it off right here. Once it's done with that, I don't need a filter on it. I want to let everything through just as it was, more or less. And so that's the basic function of the auto filter. If you're wanting to modulate something like that, obviously it's got a lot more settings than that though, so let's delve into those. So you've got the envelope setting, which is pretty important. If you understand the basics of an envelope follower, then you already pretty much understand what I'm going to cover here. What that does is that's going to modulate it up or down whenever a signal comes in. So let me demonstrate. We'll go ahead and crank it up. As you can see, a lot more high frequency content coming in now compared to where it was before. So what that does is that's essentially an, well, it is an envelope that's seeing what that signal is coming in, and it's modulating the filter up or down if you crank it the other way, depending on that signal. So when the signal comes in, it activates it, it pops up, has a specific attack. When the signal isn't coming in, it releases. Same thing as with compression as far as the attack and release are concerned. It's releasing in that time, so that filter's going back down. So it's a basic function of the envelope follower on the filter. There's also this quantize that also is a portion of the envelope. That'll essentially make it, if you have this turned on, it will only update the modulation in a rhythmic sense. So it'll be less of a sweep more of a step. So rather than having it constantly be updated, it'll pop up in increments depending on what you're choosing is. They're in 16th notes, so you could do it in eighths, whatever. Excuse me. And then you also have the LFO over here. So the basics of an LFO, if you aren't familiar, is it's going to be modulating something based on a waveform that's going very, very slow, slower than is audible to a person. So, for instance, the lowest that a human can hear, at least in theory, is 20 hertz, which is 20 repetitions of a wave per second. So LFOs are going to be way less than that. So this is in hertz, so 6 hertz. That'd be 6 repetitions per second. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the amount. So this is how much that's going to be influencing your filter cutoff, the frequency here. And then you've your rate, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's how fast it's going to be happening in hertz, so times per second. Time doing it in hertz is useful for certain things that you might want to do. Not always the most rhythmically satisfying thing, though. So that's why they include this little music note next to it. And so that switches it over to a tempo locked frequency for the LFO, which is very useful. So that'll let you set it to where the LFO is moving 16ths, whatever you want it to be. So next we have phase and offset. So the phase is going to be essentially where the LFO is where the waveform is at when it's running. So, for instance, you have a sine wave here. This is going to be really hard for me to show it in video here, but it's essentially changing where the start point is. So the more you rotate it, the further down the waveform that start point's going to be. So if you had it at a phase of 180 degrees, the start point's going to be right here rather than right here. So that's what the phase is. Offset. So the basics of phase is that's going to be essentially changing the offset between the left and right side. So it gives you a more stereo effect. So it's going to be a function of the offset, more or less. Your offset is essentially going to be where at that waveform is going to start it all, regardless of what you've the phase set to. So if you have an offset of, say, 180 degrees, it's going to start right in the middle here rather than the start of that sine wave or whatever wave you've chosen. So that's a good way of kind of tailoring it to what you want. It's not always super important. A lot of people don't ever touch offset or phase. Phase can definitely make some interesting stereo effects, though, and I'll go ahead and kind of demonstrate what the LFO is doing here. So we'll go ahead and crank the amount up just to exaggerate what it's doing. So you can really tell what's happening there. It's definitely got a very dubsteppy, wubby type thing going on. And then if we change the phase, the offset's not super obvious when we have it set up like this. If we set it to something really long, like 2, so you'll notice it starts right at that rise, starts from the midpoint, rises up, and then falls. If we set it to 180, that's going to bring it to where it's just going to fall. And then rise, and then fall. So that's what your offset's doing in practice. The last thing that we have is the resonance, which can make or break your filter. So I have this set pretty tame at 14. If you want it to be a really exaggerated effect, a lot of people use this for like white noise sweeps. You can crank it up So let me show you what that sounds like. Let me turn this LFO off now. We definitely don't need that. So the resonance is going to be essentially, it's going to apply gain positively to it right at where that cutoff is, or a little bit before it, and then it's going to have a little bit of a curve. As you can see, resonance, the higher you crank it, the more it peaks, so on. It's pretty interactive. So you already know what it sounds like at a low resonance. Let's crank it up to like 50. So it gives a pretty exaggerated effect. I mean, that's only at 52%. If you crank it way up, it is honestly kind of unpleasant. But sometimes you want to go for that audio effect. And I'm going to stop it there because once it gets past 1 kilohertz, it gets pretty ringy. So that is the basics of what that auto filter is going to do. There's a little bit more you can do with it, but it's a little bit more niche, so I'm not going to go into that. What I am going to go into, though, that's a super important principle in especially dance music, is sidechaining, which is referring to sidechain compression. What that is that's when you're using, rather than having the original audio signal drive the compressor, you're going to have a different audio signal driving that compressor. So rather than having, say, this bass right in here, we'll single one of these guys out. Not that guy. Nope. Probably should have gone with the one named bass, huh? So we'll solo that guy. So rather than having that guy trigger this compressor right here, you'll notice that's not really in sync with what's happening with our bass. So obviously that audio signal is coming from somewhere else. So what sidechain compression is, you're driving it from somewhere else. So in this case, and in the case of a lot of dance music tracks, you're having it drive from the kick. So if I solo it, now you're hearing the kick. So what that does is it gives it a very pumpy feel. It makes the song move, or it makes the synthesizers, whatever else you're sidechaining it to, makes it move and swell with the flow of the kick. So if you hear with and without sidechaining, you can hear when that thing's coming in, it's really giving it this nice move and flow where it wouldn't necessarily exist otherwise. So the way that you do that with Ableton's compressor, because it comes out of the box kind of looking something like this, or like this, what you're going to do is you just hit this down arrow. That opens up the sidechaining menu, gives you a bunch of options. So you choose an input, which is an absolutely awful looking menu with the amount of things the amount of tracks I have in here, but I have it set to kick, which is pretty straightforward. And then you choose pre, post, or post, pre-FX, post-FX, or post-mixer. So pre-FX is going to be the signal raw from the track. Post-FX is going to be after you've added whatever effects you have to it, EQs, compressors, whatever else. And then post-mixer, you're probably not going to want to touch it that much, because if you do any changes as far as gain's concerned on that track in the mixer itself, then you're going to be changing the characteristics of the sidechaining too, which can have some pretty nasty results and just take a ton of time to fix. So try to keep it pre or post FX would be my best piece of advice there. And then got the gain knob. that is just adjusting the gain for the incoming signal. I mean, unless you're really blowing it out, you are pretty much just going to be moving the threshold in the first place. And the threshold is going to serve the same purpose as it would if the track, as if you were just applying a compressor to the kick, except in this case, it's taking that and applying it to the bass. So the kick is hitting right about here, and the threshold set down to here, so you get quite a good amount of gain reduction. So it's dipping it down really quick. I've got the attack set super short and the release set decently short so that it pumps, but it doesn't have this really long build back up. And I'll show you exactly what I mean. So if you set the release high, like really high, which you can do in some tracks, and it's super popular in trance, you get a much longer release. Takes a ton longer for that signal to get back up to its normal level, and if it's super short, it's hard to tell that the side chaining's even there. So I try to keep it a pretty reasonable amount. You just kind of adjust it by ear, see what works best for you. And then another way that you can do it, if you're working with, say, a drum loop or something like that where you don't have that kick isolated, luckily, Ableton actually has this set up for you to help with that, whereas a lot of other compressors that I've used don't necessarily have that. They might have some other features, but don't have the built-in EQ. What you can do is you can change this to where it's a low pass, whatever filter. You can actually filter out those other frequencies. So for instance, most of the time if you're working with a drum loop, that kick is going to be pretty much the only thing below 160 hertz, because that's going to be your sub bass frequencies. That's going to be where you're really hearing that kick. So you can actually just EQ everything else out, which will get rid of the hi-hats and the snares to keep those from compressing it, from triggering the side chain as well and compressing your bass, or whatever other thing you have it on. And so yeah, it gives you a nice EQ, which is handy. So that's the basics of side chaining. I could probably talk about it for days, but I won't. Everything else most people would figure out by trial and error and just messing around with different things, seeing what you can come up with. There's always fun new things to be explored. So moving on from our compressor, next on here we've got auto pan. I don't think that I have auto pan anywhere on here. We'll go ahead and throw it on this though, because this will be an interesting place to have it. So auto pan, pretty straightforward idea. Makes it a lot easier to have something moving left and right than it would normally be if you were trying to draw in the modulation for the panning by hand, because I've had to do that in Reaper and it's not fun. So what you do is you pick a wave, sine, saw, whatever you want. Noise can give you some really interesting results though. We'll stick with sine just to keep things straightforward. You pick it, you just turn to mount, and luckily it has that nice visual feedback to give you more idea. We'll turn all the way up just to give it the most dramatic result. And then you've got the rate, which same thing with what we had already previously explained. You've also got the ability to switch that over to note mode. We'll switch this to 1 bar. Phase, same thing. It's just going to be moving those waves in and out of phase of each other. And then offset, same thing that I explained with the other. We'll move this. We'll keep this here. We'll adjust that. And the shape with this, it's kind of weird. It essentially is it's essentially just clipping the top and bottom of the shape and then smoothing it, so you can turn a sine into a square wave. So I'll demonstrate what it's doing here with this little percussion section. I'll keep it off at first. So it's just doing a weird thing here, and then if we bring that face, now you can really hear what's happening. It's really sweeping it left and right. Well, I guess I do have a little bit of panning modulation in there, so that contributes a little bit to what we're hearing, but not a whole lot. And then, so that shape can really make a difference. Yeah, so that's the basics of an auto panner. It's pretty straightforward, not a whole lot to say about it. So we'll get rid of that. Beat repeat, I do use that for the vocals right in here. Let me find the spot because it's kind of hidden in here. It's after the first drop.
Burning, 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 burning in my soul.
So obviously there's some pretty interesting things happening with that for the total of what, 3, 6, 10 or 11 MIDI notes that are getting hit there. So what the beat repeat does is it's taking whatever input it's given and it's just going to repeat it for a bunch of different settings that you have. So as Ableton says, interval, that's just determining when it captures new material to repeat. So that's pretty straightforward. It just depends on your source material, and you can mess with that to see what difference it makes with your beat repeat, which honestly is a lot of the settings in beat repeat. Unless you have been using it a ton, you're probably not going to know exactly what you need to do with the different settings in here to make it do what you want. So there's a lot of tweaking there. Obviously you've got a filter in here. That straightforward, same thing that we've been talking about. It's a filter. You can move it around. In this case, it's a band pass. So it's letting a specific set of frequencies through. It's essentially a low and a high pass combined. And when we drag it up, it's letting more through. Drag it down, it's letting more selective frequencies through. So that can be useful for certain things, especially if you're bringing the pitch down because you don't want it to get too low and rumbly. So the next thing we have here, offset, that's going to be essentially changing when this interval is recording. So say you want it to record every 2 bars and an eighth, which would be weird, but I'm sure there's a reason that people would want to do it. You'd set it to 2 bars, set it to 2/16. So now it's going to record every 2 bars plus a tiny little delay afterward. Just add a little granularity to the interval. You've got grid, which is going to determine how long each slice is repeated. So whenever it records new audio, that's going to determine how quickly it's repeating. So let me break down the beat repeat stuff here. So obviously modulating the grid can have some interesting effects. Let me show this big modulation that happens right here. So it's gradually speeding up, which is a pretty cool effect. You can see the grid changing here. So yeah, that's what the grid does, and it does it well. And then variation can give you some really weird effects too. That essentially is just adding a touch of random to what you're doing. My recommendation for that is you're probably going to want to record a few takes with it because it's really random. You can't repeat it very easily without a lot of tries. So if you find something you really weird repetition that you like, you want to have that saved to audio. So next we've got repeat, which will immediately capture that material, play the repetitions, and keep going. It'll just keep playing the repetitions until that button's not pressed anymore, which you can do in a live setting, or you can just record the modulation for it. So I've got it set right here, repeat. That's what keeps this going. Normally it would trail off really quickly. but I've got the repeat set up, so it just keeps. So that's what repeat does. It's handy. No triplets. That's straightforward. The grid always is set to non-triplets. I'm not sure if there's a really better way to explain that. Output mode, that makes a huge difference, and that's where things can get really confusing if you're not getting the result you're wanting. Mix is going to take both the original signal and the repetitions from beat repeat. Insert, that's going to mute that original signal whenever the repetitions begin happening. So, yeah. Gate, that's only going to let the repetitions through, so you will not hear the source signal. So let me demonstrate what those are doing. Here's mix. Insert, you've already heard what that sounds like, and then gate. So you'll notice you never heard that first repetition. Then we've got a few other settings down here. Chance, 100%, typically is what you're going to have it set at. If you're going for beat repeat type sound. There are a few other things you can do with it. If you turn it down, it's going to essentially start randomizing when those repetitions are going to play. So if we turn it down to like 50, it just kind of adds some randomness to it as well. Gate, that's going to be how long the repetitions are. Pitch, that's going to be it's going to pitch down. So obviously there's a pitch decay happening right here, which you could technically accomplish through modulating the pitch setting here. If you wanted something to go down when it repeats but not continue to go down, you would use this knob, and you just set it to whatever however low you wanted it to go, and it would play the original and then go down, say 5 steps, 6 steps, whatever you wanted. Unfortunately, you are limited to an octave, so keep that in mind. Pitch decay, that is the essential thing that's happening with this specific repetition. So it's just lowering the pitch. It's got the decay set to 34%, and so every time it repeats, it's gonna go down in pitch. And then that is the super important part of this awesome sounding little bit here. So the pitch decay set really, really quickly, so is the grid and everything else, so it gives it a very cool falling effect. So that's the basics of that. I mean, the only other thing to say would be decay, which is going to just decay the volume as it repeats. So it's going to do the same thing as pitch decay, but just with the gain. So that's the basics of beat repeat. Chorus, for those of you that aren't guitarists or haven't worked with chorus stuff before, that'll take mono or stereo and makes little layers of it on top of itself, for lack of a more technical explanation. So let me see what I've got here that this would work well with. That's pretty stereo, but we can work with that. So we'll throw the chorus on that guy. So it gives it some really interesting characteristics. And so you've got a high pass filter on this. So I mean, you can mess around with this. I wouldn't lower it below 160 hertz or really very low at all, just simply because you start getting a lot. It gets really muddy when it's really low. But you can, again, get some pretty cool effects with it, depending on where that high pass is set. You've got an option for the delays as well. So the way that a chorus works is it's giving you different delayed versions of a signal, but really, really quickly. A typical delay would not work in this manner. So it's delaying it and modulating it. So you can kind of adjust a few things here for different effects. The rate can be important because that's going to be how much it's modulating the signal, the actual pitch of the signal, and then the amount as well. So a really, really high rate is going to give you some weird alien sounding stuff though. So typically, if I was going to use a chorus for something, unless I was specifically using it for a special effect, I would be using it to widen out something or fill something up a little bit. It works very well for widening things, just in very small amounts is normally how I would recommend using it. Obviously, you can get creative, you can do some interesting things with it, but just a little bit of an amount. At a small rate. It's just going to give it just a smidge extra wideness, especially if you're working on something mono, something like that. It'll just widen it out a little bit. Makes it feel a little bit more alive. You've got feedback, which, again, can really change things. It's going to just keep that delay going once it's already begun. So when you've got the feedback really, really low, it's just going to delay once. If it's really, really high, it's going to keep on going. So there's that. Polarity just changes the signal a little bit more. I mean, there's some more technical detail you can go into with it, but just flip it around, see what sounds good. Would be the gist of it. So there's chorus, Arduino over compressor, dynamic tube is essentially going to be like your saturator, just a different form of distortion, gives it a different quality than the saturator does in Ableton. So I'll just mess around with some settings, kind of explain what I'm doing as I go, and I'll bring the lead down so I can talk over it. So what you're doing with this, and luckily this compared to the saturator is a little bit more forgiving as far as your ears are concerned, but the effect isn't quite as extreme. So what you're doing is you're just driving it into a distortion filter. And you've got 3 of them to choose from, 3 different tubes, because it's modeling a tube distorter. And you can change the output. That's straightforward, just the gain going out. Change dry wet, and then you're essentially changing the drive. So whenever it's clipping that line, that white line, that's your 0 dB mark. Whenever it clips that, it's going to be adding harmonics, changing the actual sound. And the further you go up, the weirder the sound's going to get. So tone, that's going to do very similar to what it does, to what the color mode does on the saturator. It's just going to be changing the way it sounds. Which, it sounds weird. And envelope still functions the same way it does with auto filter. In this case, it's just impacting the drive though. Or I'm sorry, impacting the bias, not the drive. So that works really similarly in function. And then bias is just going to essentially moves the input signal where the tube gives it more of a tube effect, if that makes sense. It's gonna make the signal sound like it's been run through a tube distortion. So that's the basics of dynamic tube effect. EQ8, it's graphic equalizer. We'll go ahead and make it big to make it a little bit more obvious. So it also is a visualizer, so you can see where your your input audio is across the spectrum. So see all the nice portions of the waveform. So lots of cool things about EQ8. This is another section of Ableton that I could talk about for a day. So we'll just we'll do a quick crash course in it. We'll go from left to right. So block, that's going to essentially be how many samples are analyzed per frame. So a higher amount is going to give you a lot more granularity. A lower amount is going to give you less granularity. Refresh rate, that's pretty familiar. But will also blow up your CPU if you have a lot of instances of it running. It's going to be how quickly it updates. So yeah, you can mess around with that, see what you like. And then average is just for the amount of samples that you're bringing in, block size. It's going to average them together so that it gives you a more smooth transition between each one. Or between each frame, I should say. So let's move on from that, because that's going to be shared between pretty much anything that's going to be displaying spectral information. So all of these look really similar to your filters that we talked about earlier, and they all pretty much work in the same way, except a couple other characteristics. So frequency knob, as you can see up here with the 1, that's going to be just changing where in the spectrum we're working with. And this is going to be working all the way down to 30 hertz, which, I mean, we can technically hear down to 20 hertz, but we don't really need anything down at 30 hertz or below. It's just really low rumbles at that point. And then we also work all the way up to 22 kilohertz, which most humans cannot hear above 20 kilohertz. And most adults, at least in my experience, are not hearing a whole lot of important stuff above about here. Or about here, I mean. About 13 to 15. It's just all screechy. You're not really getting a whole lot from that. So there's no need for it to go any further up than 22 kilohertz. You don't need that information. But don't get me wrong. You still need the information in here, even though we can't really discern a whole lot from it. It's still very important. So from here, we've got a gain knob, which is going to be important depending on what you've selected. So for this guy, we have a shelving filter. What a shelving filter does is from that point that you've selected, it's going to bring it up or down, however much you specify, on a curve, and then it's going to flatten out and stay that way. So if we take this spectrum, so if we wanted to cut a lot of the lows, we'd just bring it here, put a shelfer on it, boom. Not completely cut, but decreased across the board, which is great. So you use the Q on that to just essentially change how quick that transition's done. So that can be really useful in certain cases. You also have a few other filters you can choose from. The high pass times 4, that is a 4-pole high pass filter. And what pole means in relation to filters, not super important. What you need to know is it's a heavily sloped filter, whereas the normal high pass is not as steep of a slope. So it really just depends on your application, which one you use. Then you've got this guy, which is just going to affect a small band upward or downward in gain. you're going to use your cue here, which is the resonance, which we talked about earlier, to kind of shape how you're changing your sound. So if we have this cranked up, like 8, so if we change the cue, we turn the cue down, now it's impacting all of these frequencies rather than just this little pocket. We turn the cue way up, now it's just impacting this tiny area here. So that's where your cue is going to be in relation to all these. Got a notch. This guy's just going to take a little chunk of frequencies away, or a big chunk. It's at your discretion. If you have one errant frequency that's really resonating hard and you think it sounds like crap, just throw that in there and you're good to go. Then this is a high shelf filter. Works the same way as our low shelf filter earlier, only in the opposite direction. So it's going to bring your high frequencies up or down. Straightforward. And then low pass. Normal and 4-pole. Same function. So yeah, and then you get 8 of them, hence EQ 8. So you get 8 different points that you can do that on. Will you ever need 8? Probably not, but they're there. And you've got mode. This can be super helpful with certain things. So you've got stereo, which is just going to be your basic run-of-the-mill EQing. When you're changing something, you're changing it on both sides of the stereo image. That's that. Left, right, you can make it to where, for instance, our left side has this boost, but it's cut on the right side. Sounds really lopsided and weird. You can do some interesting stuff with it. Mid side might be one of the more interesting ones. You can do some really cool things with this as well. So we'd actually want to invert this. So if we cut around 1 kilohertz in the middle, but bring it up in the sides, now you're missing that in the middle, but you've got extra of it in the sides, and you can do some really interesting tricks with that to improve your stereo image and kind of change the way that the sound sits stereo wise. So here's some interesting things you can do with that. The one last, or I guess there are 2 more things, but this guy, pretty interesting. There's the audition mode. So we'll switch it back to stereo to demonstrate what I'm talking about here. So typically, messing with your EQ, unless you have a really big gain change, it can be kind of difficult to tell what you're doing or what information you're impacting. With audition mode, it gets a lot easier, because what you can do is you can just it's going to highlight the what you're impacting, as well as isolate it to where you can tell what specific impact that's having. So another handy feature. And let's see. Yeah, I guess the last thing on that is scale. Scale can be helpful depending on what you're trying to do. It's essentially just going to change what your cuts are doing. So if you have it set to 0, nothing that you do on here is going to matter. If you have it set to 100, everything is fine and dandy, works the way it should. And then you can bump the scale up, and it'll essentially just make everything more severe in the way that it does things. So that's the basics of EQA. And I'm sure what was a completely reasonable and not too long amount of time, right? Now, next, EQ3, EQ8's little brother, the quick and messy way of doing EQing. So, you'll recognize these controls: gain low, gain mid, gain high. You've got your low frequency, high frequency. What this is, 2448 dB filter switch. That is going to be changing it from, or it's going to be changing how drastic those curves are between frequencies. So if I pull up EQ8, you're essentially getting rid of this guy, changing this guy over here, moving him down here, somewhere in there, somewhere in there. And what your 2448 is essentially changing the Q on these guys so that when you're moving them, it's impacting a more specific set of frequencies, so that, say, between mid and high, the change there is at 2.5 kilohertz. It's taking place exactly at 2.5 kilohertz or less. It's going to be more spread across the spectrum. So that's that. EQ3 is great for really quick and dirty EQing stuff. So if you just know, hey, I've got this bass, it's got way too much high end, boom, you just drop the high end by a ton. So yeah, easy peasy, not a lot to EQ3. Next, we've got erosion. Erosion just adds some interesting effect to it, to whatever sound you got going on. So the basic noise, you're adding a little area of noise. So frequency, width, amount, how much noise you adding, width, how wide is that noise? Sorry, width is how wide is the frequency spectrum, or the area frequency that you're going to be adding. So yep, and then frequency, pretty straightforward. Wide noise, it's just wider. Yeah. Sine, that's just a very odd sine wave. Width doesn't do anything with sine, but yeah, so they're just different ways of modifying that signal. They do a few different things, but nothing too crazy. Does this do anything? Oh, that's some other stuff. That's, unless you're working with hardware stuff, don't worry about that. If you're working purely in software, do not worry about external audio effect. So, filter delay. This one, very important depending on what you're doing. And I highly recommend messing around from one of the presets in here. So, filter delay. I guess I should probably explain what a delay does first before I get into that. So we'll pull up the simple delay and minimize this guy. We'll move on to him because it won't take much time to explain the simple delay. So basically a delay, for those of you that don't already know, that's an echo. Just a big ol' echo. So there are a few options here. These are all in 16th notes like Ableton likes to do. So you just set your delay time to however many 16th notes you want it to be. For the left and right channel, having an offset can be really, really nice though. So if you're messing around, I recommend adding an offset to it to give it a ping-pongy effect if you're looking for something like that. Feedback, that's going to be how much of your delay is getting fed back into the delay cycle. So it's going to make it longer, more or less. Because that just keeps going. Dry wet, same thing as every other dry wet. You can also take it off of sync and set it to time. So rather than being tempo synced, you can have it just set to whatever time frame you want. I still have filter delay on. My bad. That would explain why it was so nuts. But yeah, so that's how a simple delay works. Filter delay just combines that idea with some filters. So you just kind of set your band filters wherever you want them on the signal for your left, right, and your combined channels, and it will do all sorts of great things. So you set your delay to 2, 3, 5, whatever. So it does this. You'll notice that the right side, you're getting a lot of low stuff. Left side, you're getting a lot of high stuff. And then that center area, you're getting everything in between. And so with that, you can do some super cool stuff. Especially if you have a high feedback, because it'll just kind of slowly fade into just that spectrum. That's the basics of filter delay. I mean, you've got feedback, pan, volume, all that's pretty straightforward. Just kind of mess with things until you find what you want. And yeah. And then you can also have the dry signal. That too. It works as a wet dry, but it's labeled as just dry for whatever reason. So that's our filter delay. Flanger. That's going to have a similar effect to chorus depending on what your settings are at. It works in a slightly similar way. So all flangers are a lot easier to explain by just demonstrating them. So I'm just going to do that. I am so sorry for that. That fed back really hard. But that, yeah. There's not a whole lot to say. Envelopes all work the same way. They're just going to change some effects on it. The LFO is pretty important with a flanger if you're going for, like, they used to put these a lot on guitars back in the 90s. Lots of grunge bands used flangers on their guitars. They use a lot of chorus too, but flangers wickedly popular. So especially really prominent flangers in the 90s with grunge. So that's a flanger. It's another one that you just kind of play with until you find something you like. Frequency shifter, that is exactly what its name sounds like. It shifts the frequency of an incoming signal. You can do some pretty cool stuff with it though. Yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot to say about it. You can get some pretty crazy effects with the wide set though. So that's also another really great way to widen up some mono signal if you don't have any other way to widen it. Frequency shifter also works great. Gives it a slightly different effect to chorus, which can be definitely desired. You can also do ring modulation. Sounds pretty awful though, if you don't do it right. So, got those. LFO works the same way as every other LFO that we've talked about. So we'll give it a big old thing like that. If you want to go for that real Apex Twin vibe, there's that. Already talked about gate. Glue compressor, that's really similar to the typical compressor, just has a couple other things different. You got a range now, so if we bring this threshold way down, so you can either let it 70 dB difference, or you can just bring it down. It'll only compress to a certain point, which can definitely be helpful for certain things. We'll talk about that more when I get into the mixing and mastering section of videos. It's a little bit more important there. You don't really use it a lot on instruments unless you're going for very specific things. But these work decently well, at least in my experience. I mean, you really have to mess with some of them, but a lot of the presets are great. So there's that. It's just a little bit more granular, or less granular as far as the attack, release, and ratio are concerned. But hey, what works, works. Got grain delay. This is if you want some really crazy delay stuff happening. If you've tried the simple delay and you've tried the filter delay and you're just not getting crazy enough, that's when you break out the grain delay. And boy, does it accomplish it. So, honestly, a lot of these functions, I couldn't tell you what some of them do. I just mess with them until something feels right. I mean, pitch is obvious. Random pitch, that's how random that pitch is going to be. Feedback, same thing as every other delay. So you just mess with things until something sounds good. So yeah, grain delays get weird. That's really all I got to say about that. Limiter, these are fun. They're essentially a really extreme form of compression, for lack of a better term. So you've got a ceiling. You adjust that wherever you want it. What that is that means that signal is not going to be passing that threshold. So if you set it to 1.13 decibels, does not matter how hard you push it into the thing, that's where it's getting cut. It's not going above that. It's going to essentially, on a curve, it's going to start compressing until it's at an infinite ratio to where it doesn't matter how much higher that signal goes, it's not going above that line. So when you hear something is sausage fattened or a piece of music's over compressed, that's typically what you're hearing about, is an limiter being used on it, because that's how you're going to get that really extreme effect. Look ahead is pretty important. I mean, honestly, Ableton's limiter is probably one of the most basic ones that you'll ever see. So look ahead is pretty much the only setting that matters that much in this, other than release. So the shorter your look ahead, the more distorted it's going to get, but the faster your limiter is going to respond to peaks. Release, set it to audio, set it to auto, or adjust it to whatever you want. Mess around with that until it gives you the right thing that you're wanting. And so I'll just kind of display what it does. I mean, it's just got a gain knob, so you're pushing it in extra, or pushing it in louder than the original audio, so. And you'll see that it's hitting that line and it's not going anywhere. Whereas if you don't have a limiter on, so the only thing I'm going to say about the limiter past that is use it sparingly and know when the right time to use it is. Because a lot of what you hear newer people doing is they take their master, they throw a limiter on there, and they just blast it into it, which obliterates any sense of dynamic in the mix. So you don't have quieter parts and louder parts, it's just loud all the way through. But in that same respect, using a limiter wisely, giving it a little bit of gain, and helping squish down some of the really loud peaks can help a track get a little louder without totally sacrificing all of the dynamics. So it's important to kind of know what that does. We're not really going to cover looper because it doesn't really like to work with me very well. So just for the sake of keeping the video short, I'm going to skip over looper for right now because it does not like to work with me at all. Next, got multiband dynamics. This can be a really useful tool or can completely destroy whatever sound you're working on, which is fun. So, that's going to work if any of you are familiar with Xfer's Records OTT. Same idea. They're both the same concept. They're multiband dynamics compressors. So what they do is you have 3 sets of filters: high, mid, low. Same thing as we talked about with EQ3. You've got those different bands set. With this, the difference is that you're performing compression on them rather than EQing. So let me load up one of the presets so I don't have to build one here. We'll do just the OTT one, because that has a really dramatic effect that really demonstrates what this does. So attack release times, I mean, you got input trims, so you can boost it, decrease it, whatever for the input. RMS, which anytime you see peak or RMS anywhere in Ableton, the difference is peak is going to be really, really quick to respond to peaks in the signal. So if you've got drums or whatever that are really snappy, going to want to use peak more than likely. If you've got longer things that you want it to not be as obvious that they're being modified, that's what RMS is great for. So, yeah, that's the difference. RMS is essentially going to... how do I put this? RMS is essentially going to average over a period of... RMS is essentially going to average over a period of time the audio levels. So it's not a long period of time by any means, but it's enough to where it's very different from peak. So you just kind of have to understand the difference between the two and know when it's appropriate to use both of them. When you see soft knee, that's always, or at least 90% of the time, it's going to be referring to compressors. So the difference is you've got a line like so. So you've got, we'll just do this guy. So you've got your compressor. Okay. So you've got your compressor, something like this. Well, I guess that's not a great way to do it. Just a sec. Okay, so a good way to demonstrate what that soft knee is like this. So you've got, this is your signal level, it's going up. Once it hits that compressor, that's when the compression starts. A soft knee is essentially just giving it a little bit more of a curve. It's kind of like that, rather than being this really, really sharp immediate edge. It eases into the compression a little bit more. So that's the gist of that. Let me remove this so I'm not messing with that too much. That's the gist of that. So let's go back over to this. Output trims, pretty straightforward. Attack release times, just like everything else, except in this case they're in relation to those bands. So this is where things get specific to multiband compressor. You've got below specific dB amounts. So if the signal is below this threshold, it's going to be increased by that amount. So it's going to be increased by 4.17 decibels per 1 decibel. Again, something you kind of have to just experiment with and see what you like. So it expands the signal upward, and then when it's above this threshold, it compresses the signal downward. And that works the same way as compressors that we were talking about before. So this is the gist of what it does to the signal, at least just the baseline OTT default for the multiband dynamics processor. So, is the original signal. Obviously, huge difference, really changes the tonality of the material. So you have to mess around with the presets if you don't really know what you're doing. If you do know what you're doing, then go nuts with it and figure out how everything works and what differences it's going to make to your audio. So that's multi-band dynamics. Overdrive is next. Overdrive is yet another distortion processor. So we're just going to go right into it. I'm going to jack it up to 100% wet, and we'll just get into it. Super straightforward. Just distorts it in a different way than the other guys did. And luckily having the dynamic slider here, very helpful. So it doesn't compress it as much as other ones do. Phaser, on the same kind of playing field as flanger and chorus. It's just an audio effect. Doesn't really... I can't see like a mixing or mastering purpose for a phaser. It's just there for effect. So the pulse is just notches in the frequency spectrum. It's actually really easy for me to demonstrate this one. Let me load up Serum here. Where are you? Alright. There's a phaser. These are all just different phasers. So when you're increasing the pulse, you're just increasing the notches here. So that's a pretty easy one to explain. And yeah, that's what it does. It's just a bunch of notches in a filter, and so yeah, that's another one that you just kind of have to play around with and see what you like. Just adds another effect to it. Ping pong delay, that's exactly like your simple delay, except it's going to go back and forth between the right and left speakers and has a built-in filter. So dig the ping pong delay. It's very fun. Redux. This is going to be doing bit reduction and downsampling. So this is another very special use case. Not really something you'd apply to everything, unless you were going for a very, very Nine Inch Nails-y vibe. Yeah, it's just going to do bit reduction. It's going to reduce the amount of bits that are used for that specific audio stream. So it's easier for me to show it than to explain it. Gives it a lot of distortion. Gets real loud fast too, so sorry about that. And then downsampling, that's gonna just reduce your sampling rate. So typically you're gonna be doing like 44.1 kilohertz audio sampling, so you're getting a ton of samples per second. Downsampling just turns that amount of samples down, gives you a really cool audio effect. And then there's hard or soft. It's just going to essentially impact the difference. It's just going to have a different quality to it. So hard downsampling sounds a little bit like this. And then soft sounds really cool too. So if you're feeling like Eptic, go for the downsampling and just apply it to all of your leads. You will be Eptic in no time. Resonators! Another very, very special use audio effect. This is, I honestly haven't really found a good use for resonators. I don't think I've used it in any tracks yet. It's really specific. I'm sure there's a good use case for it. I mean, especially on drums, I imagine, but for the life of me, can't figure out a good way to use it. I mean, what it does is it just resonates at specific frequencies. So it's easy to show what it sounds like. It makes everything very, very ringy. I mean, you could use it for bells or drums or something like that. But yeah, I mean, it just gives you essentially a root note, and then you just change all of them for each pitch from there, and it just takes the incoming signal, modifies it a little bit, resonates it, and outputs it. Reverb, probably one of the most important things that we'll go over today as far as production's concerned with the built-in audio effects. So reverb, that's going to be the reverberations that you hear. So, I mean, it's not echoes like a delay. It's more of what gives a sound a natural, roomy essence. So, you have a lot of functions with the reverb here. And I'm actually, rather than going into this guy, I'm just going to show you what the reverb is that I'm using on the track. So, where are you at? Our vocals, heavy on the reverb. So, I'm going to demonstrate them.
Burning in my soul.
So if we solo our reverb here, so it gives it that really nice roomy feel. So if you look here, we've got a low cut and a high cut filter. We've already gone through those. A pre-delay, so that is the amount of time before the first early reflection. So that's going to be like if you have an object or a wall or something in a room, it's going to be that first bounce back to the listener off of the wall. Pretty much always you're going to want to have that set below 30 milliseconds. After 30 milliseconds, it sounds like a delay, and it's really off-putting and odd. Unless that's what you want to go for. Spin. That's just going to be essentially... How do I explain this? It's going to give it a wider sound with spin. It's going to change the quality of the reverb as it goes on in time. It's going to change the timbre of it. So it's a lot easier for me to demonstrate here. So you can see it really changes the tone of it. So, yeah, that's a pretty useful guy to work with. It's a subtle thing, but an important one. Size of the room, also really important. That's going to be, because this is a simulation of a room after all, how big that room is. It isn't really in feet or meters or anything like that. It's honestly a pretty arbitrary number. So it doesn't really matter what the number is. It's more just going by ear and what you want it to sound like. It's like a really small size gives a very, very, very sharp metallic sound, which you can definitely be wanting to go for with certain things. So and then larger, that's going to give you that nice, soft big room reverb. Quality, unless you're running on a laptop, just have it set to high. Eco sounds like crap for a lot of things, but it uses a lot less CPU. Although, of course, sometimes you want to go with Eco. It can give you some really weird effects. Because that sounds pretty odd compared to what it sounded like in high quality. So, yeah. There's that. Diffusion network. This is going to be everything that isn't those early reflections. So you get those first couple of reflections off walls, whatnot. This is just the filters that go into the room itself rather than just the walls. It's going to be all of the different bounces and other objects that it's hitting in the room. So this is where you can kind of sculpt the reverb to have a different sound by messing with the low and high shelves. Chorus just applies a chorus effect. It's way more subtle than what we were messing with earlier. So just, again, widens it out a little bit, thickens it up just a tad. You can change the loudness of that early reflection, or the early reflections. Right here, you can change the loudness of the diffusion. You've got the stereo amount, so you get how wide it is, decay time, how long it's going to be how long it's going to be reverbing. So if you have it set to really short decay time, there's like none there. It's more or less a delay at that point, just a really short one. Whereas if it's super long, that just keeps going. Density. It's essentially the difference between yelling in a tube and yelling in a giant amphitheater. It's going to be really, really short, sharp reflections if it's turned down, or it's going to be these nice, dense ones where it's a lot of different things that are getting reverbed off. So if we turn the density all the way down, it's got a pretty delay-y sound to it, whereas if it's really high, lots of voices stacked on each other. Scale, honestly couldn't tell you exactly what this does. I just know that if it's lower, it sounds a lot brighter. If it's higher, it sounds a lot darker. So yep, that's the gist of it. So that's that. In this case, the technique I used for this song, I actually did sidechain the reverb as well to make that kick just slice through a little bit harder. But yeah, that's the gist of reverb. Already went over those guys. Already went over tuner, utility. Super straightforward little tool for Ableton. You can mute a channel through there. Don't know why you would. You can mute it right here. But go for it if you want. DC, that's a DC offset. You get that if you're using a direct current power supply on certain things. You get a little bit of crossover on it for an audio signal. So essentially, if you're looking at an audio waveform and you have it above the midline and it just stays there and then your audio changes based off that, that's where you want to hit that button, because that'll automatically correct it back to the midpoint. So you don't get what you end up with is a lot of clicks on that. You'll get little clicks every time a sound starts, so that'll fix it. In addition, you can do some really weird stuff. So if we take this, we'll actually stick this guy on the original Vox. What you can do is, in addition to just changing the overall gain of whatever you have it on, you can make it play left.
Burning in my soul,
Probably help if I soloed it.
burning in my soul, burning in my soul.
So you can't really tell because I've got the reverb and delay on, so let me turn those guys off.
Burning in my soul.
That's the original stereo source.
burning in my soul,
That's just the left channel, just the right channel, and you can swap them.
burning in my
Not super important for this audio file, but it can do some weird stuff. You can change the pan on that. The width is pretty cool. It's a handy one to be able to change. So you can make the track up to 2 times wider, which you can end up with some really odd issues with that. Sound really unnatural. Or you can bring the width all the way down to mono. So lots of options there. And then you can change your left and right phase. So if you have a piece of audio that's recorded incorrectly or something like that, or you're trying some sort of weird technique for removing like vocals from a track or something like that removing vocals or removing instruments from a track that requires phase cancellation, this is good for it. Makes it sound really weird if you leave it on by accident though, so watch out for that. Final distortion. It distorts sound, distorts a track to make it sound like it's on vinyl.
burning in my soul.
Not really any other way to put it. And then vocoder, one of my personal favorites. So this guy, lots of options here. For those of you that are unfamiliar with vocoding, vocoding is what's used to give a very specific but interesting spectral change to audio that is used in things like Daft Punk. They use it a ton with their vocals. God, I can't think of anybody else off the top of my head, but that's what a vocoder is. That's the easiest way for me to relate it to other people is Daft Punk. So with Ableton's built-in vocoder, you get a bunch of options. You can you have what's called a carrier and a modulator. Similar to the way that sidechaining works, vocoders work by having a carrier signal, which is going to be changed by your modulator signal. So you have 2 different signals feeding into the vocoder, and it changes that carrier signal by the spectral input of the modulator, which is a lot of words for it. Just changes it in a weird way. You can bring in voices or whatever, and it makes it sound like an instrument is talking. But you can use it for a lot of other things. So you don't have to just use an external modulator.